So let's move on. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Cerrato. I'm the Terra Product Support Specialist. And now that we've kicked off our workflows, we're going to learn how to monitor them, where outputs are located and referenced, and how to troubleshoot failed workflows. So hopefully everyone during the break was able to kick off their workflow. Feel free to follow along with the steps I'm outlining here. I'm going to go through some slides, and then we'll have a little hands-on session. All right, so monitoring your workflows. So when you launch your submission, you may have noticed that the Terra UI automatically redirected you to the job history page. This is the page that shows you all of the workflows that you currently are running in your workspace or previously run, along with their status and links to further information. So if we just launch an analysis and we want more detail about the status of a particular workflow, we're able to click on any of those workflows to get more details. So first, let's talk about workflow outputs. Once your workflow is complete, you probably want to see what outputs were generated by the workflow, because you might want to use those outputs in another step of your analysis, or you have just reached the end of your analysis and you want to get your final outputs. So there are a couple of places you can look for the outputs, and Tiffany alluded to this in the previous presentation. One place you can go is the file section of your workspace. You'll see there are, in this screenshot, there are a couple of links that are long strings, and those are the same characters of the submission ID for the workflow you just ran. So if you click into any one of those, you're able to see any of the files generated by that workflow. But it's not so easy to remember exactly like what the job ID was for the submission you just ran. And altogether, this isn't the tidiest way to organize your data. And that's why we recommend writing your metadata back to the data table, where you can keep things more organized. And that's why we filled out that output section in the previous presentation, so that all of the data that was generated from the workflow would go back to the data table. And the jobs that we're currently running take a while, so you probably don't have anything there now, but we have some examples of what would be output. And so like I mentioned, the other place that you can write data out to is the data table. The files actually exist. They just exist in the Google bucket, but Terra is smart. So if you choose a place in the data table to output to, what it's basically doing is it's editing that data table so that it'll show you in the column you specify that file that you were specifying in the output. And behind the scenes, it's pointing to the location in the bucket. So this is really useful if you want to run further downstream analysis. Just like in the workflow we just ran, we did this dot and then chose the column that we wanted to run on. If you had another workflow you wanted to run, you can now do this dot and then the new column name. And Terra will automatically pull that information from the proper place in the data table. So it's much easier to reference the data table rather than having to type out a GS string path every time you want to run analysis. And this allows you to run workflows on numerous samples or numerous data at the same time, rather than having to do them one at a time. So what about if your workflow failed? This is just a normal part of doing analysis. Things will fail. And there's a number of reasons why things can fail. So it's important to know how to troubleshoot the situations. So there are a few different reasons why things can fail. The Terra UI does a good job of providing you at a few different levels information about the workflow. And if it failed for any reason, we find there are different ways that you can find out information for why it failed. So one thing you can do, once you click into one of those submissions on the job history page, and I will go over this with an example in a second, you can view basic information about what kinds of errors the Google machine ran into. You can go further down and look at the log for the run that you did, or the standard error file, which should provide you some information about what went wrong there. There are a few different ways that workflows can fail. If they fail immediately, there are some things that are common, like data access issues. So if you specify a specific file you want to run your analysis on, or you want to use a file in your analysis, sometimes workflows will fail immediately because you don't actually have access to the file. So that might be something you have to remedy. There are also the variable attributes. If they weren't set correctly, that's another reason why things would fail. So there are many, many reasons why this could happen, but we have a few different tools you can use to figure out what went wrong and then what you can do to fix it. Other common failures are localization failures. So whenever the VM is running, the Google virtual machine has to first localize all of the files. So if there was any failure in localization, that means that, again, you might not have access to that file. And another point to consider is quotas. If you're working with a very, very large group and you're running a lot of analysis, every Google project has a certain cap on the quota for resources. So if everyone is requesting resources, your jobs may be slow, or they may not run because the quota is being hit. And we have an article which can teach you more about that and provide you a resource for how to request a quota increase. All right, so let's transition to a hands-on section of monitoring and troubleshooting workflows. So first thing we're going to look at is monitoring. So right now here I have my cloned Anvil open access data workspace. I'm going to go to the job history page to see the jobs that I've run before and the jobs currently running. So everyone should have a aligner whittle job currently running. If you click on that, you'll be brought to another level down, which shows you more details about the job. So you can see which data entity you're running on, when it was last changed. You can see the current status of the job, and the workflow ID as well as the submission ID. You can also see some of the options that we chose in the previous run will show up here. So if you enable or disable call caching, that'll show up here. Same with delete intermediate outputs. And if you want to look at the job currently running in more detail, you click View on the workflow ID, which will navigate you to the job manager page. And you can see here, I know for sure that this task or that this job has 3 tasks total. And I can see based on this page here that it's currently working on the pre-aligned task. So if you had a workflow with multiple tasks and you want to get a quick sense of, where is it in the workflow? How far along is it? This is a really good way to get a quick glance at the progress of the job. You can review the inputs that you provided here. Some of these you may not recognize, but they may be things that are defined by the whittle or by Google. So you don't have to worry about those as much as the ones that you know for sure you provided. Like for instance, the input cray file, it'll provide the GS path. Because even though we provided a this dot input cray file, on the Google side of things, they're interpreting a path. So they'll show you the full path for the file that you input. And then if you go to the timing diagram, this doesn't have any information right now, but as workflows progress, and I'll show you one that finished, it'll show you the length of time it's spent working on each part of the workflow. So this is one that's in progress. You also have the option to abort the job over here at the top right. So let's go back to our job history page. And let's look at one that finished. So I'm going to go jump over to the workspace that Ali worked on. And if we look at the successful run here, I see some people in the comments are having some trouble getting into the view. And for now, just feel free to watch this, and then we'll gather up together to resolve the issue. And you can look over the slides and go over this on your own time. All right, so looking at the successful job, you can see that there are the 3 tasks here. The statuses are all successful. It tells you the start time, it tells you the duration. From this list view, you can also easily see the specific inputs for any of the tasks as defined in the whittle, as well as the outputs. This one is fairly long, but depending on your job, it may be short, it may be long. You can also look at the inputs and outputs more directly using these tabs here. And here's that timing diagram I mentioned before. So this breaks down the amount of time each of the tasks took. It gives you colors to show what parts of the process, like what parts took the longest, or what amount of time. And it gives you some information about like the specific hours as well as the duration. So that might be a good way if you're using a workflow of your own design or one that you're not familiar with. You can use this to get a better sense of like how it works. And I don't want to go too much over time, but I just want to give everyone a quick glance at some of the ways you can do troubleshooting steps. So if you go, for instance, to one of them that failed, I can see in this job that it failed. And there's a little message here that says expected single value for workflow input, but evaluated result set was empty. And it tells me that there was an issue with the input cram file variable. And so what happened in this job was that I mistyped the attribute, and the input cram file variable couldn't read it because I didn't type it correctly. And I fixed it in this job, this next one, and so it ran successfully. And I can quickly show you what it looks like when it fails as well. I'll post a screenshot in the Slack channel later on so that people can see the difference between the successful and the failed run and how I figured, or how I configured the method configuration. And then one last note on here. Ali and I are on the same team, and we may be running analysis separately, but like we mentioned before, you might not want to regenerate things from scratch if someone on your team has already done the work. So for this run, I ran it on the same sample that Ali ran on, and I enabled call caching. And so the result of that is that because Ali already ran her job and did all of this work, this finished immediately because Terra already knows that this was already done before. And so this is a really, really good way to save money and time. So like we said before, every time you launch a submission, you'll be redirected to the job history page, and you can get more details about your particular workflows there.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
For how long are they cached?
I believe they're essentially indefinitely cached unless someone deletes the outputs at some point along the way.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
You pay for those cached files, by the way. I believe that's true, that they are stored in your workspace bucket. So it is best practices to go back and delete the cache files if you don't need them. It kind of depends on your use case, whether you want to keep them, and it's a trade-off between, if you have to rerun the analysis because you haven't saved those outputs, that sort of thing. So there's some nuance there.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. So whenever there's a workflow that you're running and you're able to use cached results, essentially what you're doing is just making copies of the cached files. So you're still paying for storage in that case, but you're not paying for all of the compute time that you might have to if you did it from scratch. So here are just some slides of the things we just went over. Here are some useful resources. Everyone has access to these slides. So there are some video tutorials that'll take you through the different parts of Terra, including the Workflows Quick Start featured workspace we have. There's some documentation here about troubleshooting. So occasionally you'll get a specific Google error message, and you might want to know how to get around that issue. So the troubleshooting section is really good for that. The Workflows Quick Start is a great place to start if you want to get a little bit more experience with workflows beyond this presentation. And then, yeah, there's some other resources here for showcase workspaces, whittles, and Dockers. So in this presentation, you learned how to monitor workflows, you learned where outputs are located and referenced, and finally, you learned a little bit about how to troubleshoot. So maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions if there's anything on the top of anyone's mind. If not, we'll always be in the chat and the Slack channel. And as always, if you have any problems working on the Terra platform, you can always contact Terra support and we'll be happy to help.